people who are church gurus will tell you that the people who visit for the first time in Christian congregations on Sunday morning have had some kind of suffering or some kind of experience within the past 6 months that has caused them great grief. Almost everyone who visits a church for the first time brings with them that kind of history. Directly and indirectly, bad things happen to us. We are not immune from the misfortunes of life. Sickness, pain, disappointment, economic losses, emotional disturbances, and death are no respecter of persons. We are all vulnerable. Like other human beings, Christians don't like it when suffering comes our way either. Like others who are hurt in a deep way, we respond with anger, fear, despair, rejection, and grief. In some ways, Christians may react even more negatively to adversity because we may have thought that our pious lifestyles and trust in God's providence would shield us from the unpleasant realities of life. There is some biblical material that can be very helpful to us in times of suffering. It is the biblical lament, a prayer offered up to God in times of deep trouble. Approximately 60 of the 150 psalms are either laments or contain elements of lament. 60 out of the 150. As we have sometimes stifled the efforts of individual sufferers to speak about honest and negative thoughts and feelings, so also we have squelched the use of laments. They seem unnatural and unduly pessimistic to most of us. Raise your hand if you've ever been to a presentation in the life of the church on laments. That makes my point. We leave them out of our hymn books and don't use them often in worship. If we happen to stumble across them as we read through our Bibles, we wonder what such negative, uninspiring stuff is doing in the Scriptures. Some of them are pretty brutal when you read the laments in the Psalms. Psalm 137, talking about children being injured, their heads bashed against the stone. Raw honesty. The song that we have here this afternoon, Psalm 22, starts out like this. My God, why have you forsaken me? I am a worm and not human, scorned by others and despised by the people. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. When I visit in the hospitals week in and week out, I hear a lot of people talking about their bones feeling out of joint. Biblical faith does not beat around the bush or cloak pain in pretty phrases. Laments allow honesty, realism, and integrity. Martin Luther said this about the Psalms. He often, during his day, made fun of the Bible picture books that were floating around during the medieval times that people would spend great money for, that had the pictures of the stories of the people in the Bible, and Luther said, you don't need those picture books. Guess what? We already have it. It's the book of Psalms. In the Psalms, you see and hear the saints of God in every aspect of human life. Many persons are relieved to find expression of negative feelings in the Bible. It provides some balance over against the pressure to pretend, to be up, to smile when they feel like crying, to say they believe when they are full of doubts. And some people even begin to doubt their own sanity when they're going through struggles, because it appears that everyone expects them to get along to go along. Laments help keep the conversation with God real and open. How do you pray to God when you do not feel like praising, giving thanks, and being nice? I was brought up to be nice. I grew up in the American South. And some of this about the laments cuts against a lot of what I was brought up with. You don't share those kinds of raw feelings with other people, and it's irreverent to share those things with God. But a lament psalm like Psalm 22 is a prayer for difficult times. It is a way to keep talking when we would prefer to draw away from God in doubt or disgust or anger or fear. At a time when our faith may be under trial, it is better to keep praying and with honest prayers than to stop praying because we can't come up with the sweet and pious words that we had spoken so easily in more pleasant days. The inclusion of such prayers in our Bible is a reminder that God encourages us to keep talking when our theology is mixed up and we are angry and say things that we would never say if we were not so desperate. One of my favorite movies with biblical themes is The Apostle with Robert Duvall. Any of you have ever seen that film? It's sort of set in the American South. It's a bit exaggerative at points, but there's a scene in The Apostle where Robert Duvall's character, who's kind of like a freelance preacher, is on the second floor in the house, and he's just yelling at God, and he's just having a real spat with God. And why is this happening? Why is my life such a struggle? And he was saying it so much that finally the neighbors started coming around his house, and they were wondering whether he was okay or not. He had a real brouhaha with God on the second floor of that house. A lament helps us to work through a process of catharsis that's often necessary in times of suffering and grief. The Christian philosopher Nicholas Waltersdorf says this: why insist on never outwarding the inward when that inward is bleeding? Why insist on never outwarding the inward when that inward is bleeding? A typical lament begins with a complaint addressed to God. It is important that it is addressed to God. It's not just purposeless whining into the wind, but it is coming to God, the one who can hear and help. And it is also important that the complaint comes first, that we have the opportunity to say what hurts us. Luther calls this ringing the words into God's ears. And once we have had the opportunity to say our piece, then we will be better able to hear the good news that God has heard our pleas and will come to help. And so the typical biblical lament, as I had just read it a few moments ago, begins with the complaint and all the stuff about my mouth is like a potsherd and all that kind of stuff. And it moves through the verses until the end, where the psalm comes to a point where the believer can praise God once again. The lament helps us remember the experience of God's people who cried to God for help in times of adversity and ultimately sang God's praise for the deliverance that came. This is difficult stuff sometimes. One of the most difficult times in my ministry was when I was serving a congregation in Newtown, New Jersey, early on in that congregation. And it was around this time of the year that I got the call late one afternoon that one of our kindergarten-age girls was run over by a school bus. It was actually the case that precipitated in New Jersey, I'm not sure if it's in Pennsylvania, where you have that long arm that comes out so that the child has to walk all the way out so that the bus driver can see the child going in front of the bus. That was the case that led to that safety measure. Her name was Krista Lee, and she was, it was tragic. Having to meet with her Sunday school class the Sunday after that happened to lead the worship service. And the text for that service that I used for my sermon was Psalm 22. It was the only way to express the raw feelings that the parents had, and the friends, and the school, and the after-school program that she was going to. It's important to remember that one of the last words of Jesus from the cross is a lament. The opening verse of this psalm this afternoon, Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Those words of Jesus, channeling the suffering experiences of Israel, have been troublesome for Christians down through the ages. Why would Jesus say a thing like that? How could it be that he felt abandoned by God? If we have the urge to stifle lament, even from an ordinary human being, we certainly don't want to hear such raw language from Jesus. And yet it's right here in our inspired scriptures. Jesus suffered deeply on the cross. And surely that agony was a terrible experience for him. It wasn't just the physical agony, it was the isolation, it was the rejection, it was the debasement by other people. The words of the psalm would have helped him pray what was on his mind and heart. Psalm 22 would have been an appropriate prayer from the book of Psalms. Jesus prays from two of the Psalms from the cross. Psalm 22, and then he also prays the psalm at the end when he says, into your hands I commend my spirit. Jesus was fully human. He knew what it was like to feel frightened and abandoned, but Jesus was also divine. And that means that God knows about our suffering. God has been there with us. When we cry out to God in our times of suffering, we know that we will be heard by one who truly knows what we have gone through. It is a great comfort for a sufferer to know the presence of an understanding and compassionate God who not only invites our human prayers, but also knows what it is like to be one who needed to pray like that also. God hears. God understands through and through. God suffers with us. One who has been there and done that hears